Tucson, Arizona. October 1961. There is a particular kind of shop that accumulates at the edges of western towns the way driftwood accumulates at the bend of a river. Not planned, not designed, just gathered, piece by piece, over years, from the estates of dead men and the desperation of living ones, and the long, slow process by which objects outlast the people who understood what they were. Brannigan's trading post sat on a side street, 2 blocks off the main commercial strip in Tucson, in a building that had been a feed store, then a machine shop, then nothing for a while, and was now floor to ceiling with the accumulated evidence of 100 years of Arizona life. Guns, tack, spurs, belt buckles, bridles, barbed wire stretched on frames, Indian pottery behind glass, Navajo blankets folded on a shelf, photographs in frames nobody had dusted since Eisenhower, arrowheads in a flat case by the register. A buffalo skull above the door that had been there so long it had become invisible to everyone who worked there. The man behind the counter on a Tuesday morning in October was named Gerald Brannigan. He was 53 years old. He had run the shop since his father died in 1949. He knew the price of most things, and the story behind fewer of them than he would have liked and more of them than most people suspected. He was not a dishonest man, but he was a man who had learned the trade from the buying side, which meant he had learned that the first number you say is the one that sets the terms of everything that follows. On a Tuesday morning in October of 1961, a man walked into Brannigan's trading post with a gun wrapped in burlap under his arm, and Gerald Brannigan made a mistake. Not a dishonest one. Just the kind a man makes when he is too quick and too confident and too accustomed to being the most knowledgeable person in the room. This is what happened. First, the gun. You need to understand the gun before you can understand the morning. It had come into Tucson in 1849, which is to say it came in at the beginning of things, when Tucson was still a presidio town barely separated from the desert, and the men who moved through it were moving through the last open country in North America and knew it. The man who carried it was named Callum Shaw. He was a Scotsman by birth and an Arizonan by the time he got there, which meant he had already crossed enough of the continent to have shed everything that was not essential. He carried 2 things from Scotland: a Bible with his mother's name on the flyleaf and the pistol. The pistol was a Scottish Highland flintlock, made in Edinburgh around 1780 by a maker named James Murdoch, who was one of the 2 or 3 best pistol makers in Scotland at a time when Scottish pistol making was the finest in the world. If you know the Murdoch name, you already understand what that means. If you do not, here is the short version. The Highland flintlock pistol was a distinct form, different from English and French and German work in its proportions and its decoration and its lock mechanism, all 3 of which Murdoch understood at a level that separated him from his contemporaries, the way a Stradivarius is separated from other violins of the same era. Not by magic, by accumulated mastery applied with complete attention at every stage of the work. The Shaw pistol had been with the family since Callum's grandfather. It went to Callum because Callum was the eldest and because his father believed a man going to the far side of the world should carry the best thing the family had. Callum Shaw never fired it in Arizona. He kept it. He cleaned it. He passed it to his son in 1881 when the son was 20, and Callum was old and could feel that he was going to be older than he wanted very soon. The son passed it on, and the son after that. By 1961, the pistol had come down through 4 generations of Shaws in Arizona. The last of them was a man named Dennis Shaw, who was 44 years old and worked as a mechanic in a garage on the south side of Tucson and had 3 children in school and a truck that needed a new transmission and a house note that was 2 months behind. Dennis Shaw did not know what the pistol was. He knew it was old. He knew it had come from Scotland with his great-great-grandfather and that his grandfather had told him to keep it. He knew it was made of metal, steel, and brass, and that the steel had rusted in places and the brass had gone green in others, and that the wooden stock had a crack along the right side that had been glued once and was not going to hold forever. He knew he needed $400 for the truck transmission and could not afford to need it from his regular income. He wrapped the pistol in burlap, the way his grandfather had kept it, and drove to Brannigan's trading post on a Tuesday morning because Brannigan's was where Tucson brought things when it needed to turn them into money. Gerald Brannigan unwrapped the burlap on the counter and looked at what was inside. He saw rust. He saw verdigris. He saw a cracked stock. He saw an old pistol in rough condition, the kind that passed through his shop a dozen times a year, brought in by people who believed family mythology had transformed an ordinary object into a treasure and were usually wrong. He did not look at it long. "Flintlock pistol," he said, "old. Rough condition. I can do $15. Dennis Shaw looked at the gun on the counter. He had been hoping for more. He had been hoping in the way a man hopes when the math is desperate, that his grandfather's instructions to keep it meant the thing was worth keeping for a reason that would now translate into transmission money. $15 was not transmission money, but Dennis Shaw was a mechanic, not an antique dealer, and Gerald Brannigan was the professional in the room, and $15 was $15. He was about to say yes. The bell above the door went. The man who came in was not in a hurry. He moved through the shop the way people move through Brannigan's when they know the kind of place it is and are not looking for anything specific, which is the best way to look for things in a shop like that, a general attention, an openness to what is there rather than a search for what you came in expecting to find. He was tall, he wore a canvas jacket and plain trousers and a hat that anyone in Tucson that year would have recognized, though it was not a famous hat. It was just a good hat, well worn, belonging to the head beneath it, the way a good hat belongs. He looked at the buffalo skull above the door. He looked at the Navajo blankets. He came down the main aisle, and his eyes went across the counter the way eyes go across a counter in a trading post, efficiently cataloging, and then they stopped. They stopped on the pistol. He came to the counter. He did not say anything for a moment. He looked at the pistol the way the rancher Frank Aldis had looked at an empty shelf in a saddle shop, the way a man looks when something is registered and he is taking it seriously before he says anything about it. "May I?" he said. Gerald Brannigan looked at the big man on the other side of his counter and recognized him the way everyone in Tucson recognized him in 1961, because he had been making pictures in and around Tucson on and off for 15 years, and his face was on every movie poster in every theater in the country. "Help yourself," Brannigan said. The man picked up the pistol. He did not pick it up the way most people picked up old guns in trading posts, loosely by the barrel, holding it away from themselves slightly the way you hold something you're not sure about. He picked it up properly, muzzle down, left hand under the action, right hand around the grip, the way a man picks up a firearm when he knows what a firearm is and respects it regardless of its condition. He turned it over. He looked at the lock. He went still. Here is what he was looking at. The lock of a Murdoch Highland flintlock is distinct in 3 ways that matter to a man who knows what he is looking at. The first is the cock, the piece that holds the flint and falls forward to strike the frizzen. On a Murdoch pistol, the cock is shaped differently from English or French work, with a particular curve at the jaw that is partly functional and partly the maker's signature, the way a saddler's vine is partly ornamental and partly the mark of who made the thing. The second is the frizzen itself, the steel plate that the flint strikes to produce the spark. Murdoch frizzen work has a specific angle and a specific face geometry that came from his understanding of ignition physics at a time when most makers were still working by feel and tradition. The third is the proof mark. Every Scottish gunmaker who was a member of the Edinburgh Incorporation of Hammermen, the guild, the body that regulated the trade, used a proof mark stamped into the lock plate. Murdoch's mark was a small thistle with a specific number of points on the leaves, struck with a specific tool that was Murdoch's and nobody else's. Under the rust on the lock plate of the pistol Dennis Shaw had brought in wrapped in burlap. If you knew where to look and had looked at enough Murdoch work to recognize what you were seeing, you could make out the thistle. The man at the counter had looked at enough Murdoch work. He was quiet for a long time. He looked at the stock crack. He looked at the barrel, which was iron, and had rusted but had rusted evenly, which meant it had been kept out of standing water, which meant the bore was probably intact. He looked at the brass furniture, the trigger guard, and the butt cap and the side plate, which had gone green but had not pitted, which meant the alloy was right, which was another mark of Murdoch's quality. He set the pistol down on the counter. He looked at Gerald Brannigan. "What did you offer him?" he said. Brannigan had the grace to hold the man's eyes. "15, he said. "Dollars, yes." The man was quiet. He was not angry. You could not have called it anger. It was something quieter than anger, and in some ways more serious. The expression of a man who has added something up and does not like the total but is not going to perform outrage about it. He looked at Dennis Shaw. "This your family's?" he said. "Yes, sir. Come down 4 generations. From Scotland." Dennis blinked. "That's right. My great-great-grandfather brought it in 1849. The man nodded. He looked at the pistol again. "Do you know what it is?" he said. "Old," Dennis said. Family always said to keep it. Your family was right. The man turned the pistol over once more. He pointed without touching. You see the lock plate there? Under the rust on the upper left. You can just make it out. Dennis leaned in. Looks like a stamp of some kind, he said. It's a thistle. Maker's proof mark. Edinburgh Guild, late 18th century. He set it down. This is a James Murdoch pistol, Scottish Highland flintlock, made in Edinburgh, I would say around 1775 to 1785 based on the cock profile and the frizzen geometry. Murdoch was the best pistol maker in Scotland at a time when Scotland was making the best pistols in the world. The shop was quiet. Even Brannigan was quiet. What does that mean? Dennis said. He meant what does it mean in the practical sense, the transmission sense. The man looked at him steadily. In the condition it's in right now, with the stock crack and the surface rust, it means several $100s to the right collector. Cleaned properly, the bore checked and found intact, the stock stabilized by a man who knows wood. It means considerably more. There are auction houses in New York and London that would know exactly what this is. In London particularly. This is a piece of Scottish national heritage that ended up in Arizona. That story alone is worth something to the right institution. Dennis Shaw said nothing. He looked at the pistol on the counter as though he was seeing it for the first time, which in every way that mattered he was. Gerald Brannigan cleared his throat. I may have been hasty, he said. On the price, I didn't have a close look. The man turned to him. No, he said, you didn't. There was a silence. Brannigan had been on the buying side of his counter for 22 years. He knew what it felt like when the room had turned against him, and there was no point pretending otherwise. I could go higher, he said. On the pistol. How much higher? The man said. Brannigan calculated. The way he always calculated from the outside in, from what he could sell it for to what he was willing to pay. The trouble was that his calculation depended on what he could sell it for, which depended on what it was worth, which he had just discovered was considerably more than he had assumed. He named a figure. It was better than $15. It was not close to what the pistol was worth. The man looked at him. No, he said. He turned to Dennis Shaw. Don't sell it here, he said. Not today. Not for that. He reached into his coat and took out a small notebook and a pen. He wrote two things on a page, tore it out, and put it on the counter in front of Dennis. First one is an auction house in Scottsdale. They handle Western and historical firearms. They'll know what it is. Second one is a man in Santa Fe, a conservator. He works on historical metalwork and wood. You take the pistol to the Scottsdale house first and get their assessment before you decide anything. Tell them what you know about the provenance, the year it came from Scotland, the family name. Provenance adds to the value. Every generation you can document adds to it. Dennis looked at the paper. I need transmission money, he said. It came out plainer than he intended. I know, the man said. The auction house will advance against assessed value if you tell them you need it. Ask them. Don't let them tell you they can't do it before they've checked. They can do it. He looked at the pistol one more time. How much is the transmission, he said. Dennis told him. The man took out his wallet. You know what came out of the wallet. You have seen it before, in this story and the two before it. Cash. Counted on a counter. A specific amount for a specific purpose, delivered without ceremony and without requiring gratitude. He covered the transmission. He did not touch the pistol money. He was explicit about that. The transmission was a loan, he said, which Dennis could repay when the auction house settled, and if the auction house settlement was less than expected and the repayment was a hardship, then they would work something out. He said it the way a man says a thing when he means it and does not need to elaborate. Dennis Shaw looked at the money on the counter. He was a mechanic. He was a practical man. Practical men in his position did not turn down money for transmissions from strangers and trading posts, because practical men understood that what was being offered was not charity but a bridge, and a bridge is a functional object, not a sentimental one. He took the money. He wrapped the pistol back in its burlap. He shook the man's hand and thanked him and meant it in the wordless way that men mean things they cannot find the right words for. The man nodded. He looked at Brannigan once more, not accusingly, just clearly. The look of a man who has said what needed saying and does not plan to repeat it. He walked back up the main aisle past the Navajo blankets and the arrowhead case, and under the buffalo skull above the door, he went out. The bell above the door went quiet. Dennis Shaw took the pistol to the Scottsdale auction house that Thursday. He told them the provenance. He told them the family name and the year, and the great-great-grandfather's crossing from Scotland in 1849. He told them a man had identified the maker and described what to look for on the lock plate. The assessor at the auction house was a woman named Patricia Holt, who had been evaluating historical firearms for 11 years, and who looked at the lock plate under a loupe for approximately 4 seconds before she set the loupe down and looked at Dennis Shaw with an expression that mixed professional composure with something that was very close to excitement. She cleaned the lock plate herself, carefully, with a cotton swab and a solution she mixed from a bottle in her desk, and the thistle came up clear. James Murdoch. Edinburgh. Late 18th century. Intact action. Bore, checked the following day by their conservator, found clean. The assessment value came in at $1,100 in current condition. With professional conservation of the stock and metalwork, the conservator estimated a restored value between $1,800 and $2,200. In London, at the Wright House, with the provenance documented, he said he could not put a ceiling on it with confidence. Patricia Holt advanced Dennis Shaw $400 against the assessed value that afternoon. He drove to the garage on the south side of Tucson and paid for the transmission and drove home in a truck that ran. He did not find out who the man in the trading post was until the following week. His eldest daughter came home from school on a Wednesday and said that her friend's mother had seen her father's truck outside Brannigan's trading post the week before, and that her friend's mother said she had also seen John Wayne go into Brannigan's that same morning because she had been walking past and had to look twice. Dennis was at the kitchen table with coffee. He set the cup down. He looked at the notebook page still folded in his shirt pocket, which he had been carrying because he had not figured out where else to put it. He took it out and unfolded it. The Scottsdale auction house name, the Santa Fe conservator name, 2 lines of handwriting. He had not asked for a name at the counter. He had been too stunned by what had just happened to his understanding of what he was carrying under that burlap to think about names. And the man had not offered one, for the same reason he never offered one, because the name was not the point and he knew it. Dennis's daughter was looking at him from the kitchen doorway. Was it? She said. Dennis looked at the notebook page. He thought about the lock plate and the thistle and the way the man had known where to look without being told, and the 4 generations of Shaws in Arizona who had kept a thing they did not understand because someone above them had said to keep it. Yes, he said. His daughter's eyes went wide. He folded the notebook page and put it back in his pocket. Set the table, he said. Your mother's going to want to hear this. The auction settled in January of 1962. Patricia Holt had found a buyer in Edinburgh, a private collector with a specific interest in Murdoch work who had been looking for an example in this condition for years. The provenance, the Shaw family name, the documentation Dennis had assembled with Patricia's help letters, photographs, his grandfather's written account of the pistol's history going back to Callum's Crossing, had done what the man in the trading post said provenance would do. It added to the value. The final settlement was just under $2,000. Patricia Holt's commission came off the top. The $400 advance came off the balance. The transmission loan repayment came out of what remained. Dennis Shaw put the rest in a savings account at First National in Tucson that he had opened for that specific purpose. He labeled it in the ledger the way a practical man labels things. He wrote, Shaw, Scotland Fund. He was not entirely sure what it was for yet. He had some ideas. They involved his eldest daughter, who was 12 years old, and asked good questions and was going to want to go to college in 6 years, and was going to need someone to have made a good decision about a rusty gun in a trading post. Gerald Brannigan did not stay exactly as he was after that Tuesday. Give him this. He was not a man who learned slowly when the lesson was clear. He had made a mistake in front of a witness who knew exactly what the mistake was, and he had understood the mistake in real time, which is the hardest way to understand anything. He called Patricia Holt at the Scottsdale auction house the following week. He told her he ran a trading post in Tucson and that he needed to know more about historical firearms than he currently knew, and that he understood she was the person to talk to about that. She was. They had a professional relationship for the next 20 years. She sent him monographs. She took his calls when he had questions about something on his counter that he was not sure about. She came to Tucson twice and spent a day going through his back room inventory and found 3 things he had been undervaluing, and 1 thing he had been overvaluing, and told him the difference between them and why. He never offered $15 for something he had not looked at closely again. He could not claim he never made mistakes. He made mistakes. Everybody in the trade made mistakes. But he did not make that one again. Dennis Shaw's daughter went to the University of Arizona in 1967. She studied history. She wrote her senior thesis on Scottish immigration patterns to the American Southwest in the 19th century, which was a subject she had come to through a family story she had heard at a kitchen table when she was 12 years old. The thesis was well regarded. She went on to graduate school. She became a professor. She spent a career teaching students to look at objects the way a certain man in a trading post had looked at a lock plate, which is to say, to see what is actually there before they decide what something is worth. She never met him. She would have had things to say to him. She said them instead to 30 years of students in classrooms in Tucson, which is one of the ways these things propagate forward when the direct line is not available. The pistol is in Edinburgh. It has been there since 1962, in the collection of a private family who donated it to a museum on long-term loan in 1978. It is in a case with 11 other examples of Scottish Highland pistol work. The card beside it gives the maker, the date, the method. At the bottom of the card, below the conservation notes, there is a provenance line. It reads, "Carried to Tucson, Arizona Territory, 1849, by Callum Shaw of Aberdeenshire. Retained by the Shaw family of Tucson, Arizona, through 4 generations. Sold 1962. That is what 4 generations of keeping a thing looks like on a museum card. Callum Shaw carried it across the Atlantic and across the continent because his father told him to take the best thing the family had into the far country. He could not have known what the card would say. He carried it anyway. $15. That is where the morning started. $15 on a counter in a trading post on a side street in Tucson for a pistol that had crossed an ocean and a continent and come down through 112 years of American life without being lost or sold or destroyed. One man in a canvas coat who knew where to look on a lock plate. 2 lines of handwriting on a torn notebook page. $400 advanced against an assessed value for a transmission on a Thursday. A settlement in January that paid for a college education that produced a professor who spent 30 years teaching students to look at things the way the thing deserves to be looked at. The pistol is in a case in Edinburgh with a card beside it. The card does not mention a Tuesday morning in October of 1961. It does not mention a trading post, or a counter, or a wallet, or a man who knew a thistle when he saw one under the rust. It does not need to. The pistol is there. The card is accurate. The Shaw name is on it. That is enough. That is exactly enough. The far country is not so far as it was in 1849. But people are still carrying the best things their families have into it, still keeping what they were told to keep without always knowing why, still walking into rooms where someone might look at what they are carrying and see it clearly. That is the oldest transaction there is. It does not require a name. It just requires someone who knows where to look. If this one found you, pass it on, share it with someone who has kept a family thing without knowing why. Someone who has been told to hold on to something and held on. Subscribe if you haven't yet. More Duke stories coming.